The woman who came up the road to the Garnet Creek Ranch looked like someone the world had already decided not to notice. That was Maeva Hollowell's first thought, as she stood at the kitchen window with flour still on her hands and watched the figure move along the dirt track from the direction of Alkali, the nearest thing this corner of Montana Territory had to a town in 1883. Small, that was the word that came first. Not delicate, not precious. Just small in a way that draws no second look. Brown hair pulled tight, under a bonnet mended along the brim, with stitches too neat to be careless and too visible to be hidden. A dress the color of creek mud after rain, clean but worn past any memory of newness, hemmed an inch shorter than fashion required. The practical adjustment of a woman who walks more than she rides. She carried one bag, a single carpet bag with a broken clasp held shut by a leather strap, and she held it in front of her with both hands, gripping it with the quiet intensity of a person who knows it contains everything they own, and knows it is not impressive. She was not beautiful. Maeva could see that, even at a distance, and the seeing of it settled somewhere behind her ribs, because Maeva had written to the marriage broker in St. Louis, with specific terms: good health, good character, willing to work. She had not written the word beautiful. She had not needed to. It had lived between the lines, unspoken but luminous. The hope that, whatever arrived to save them might at least look like salvation. This woman did not look like salvation. She looked like someone who had been surviving for a long time, without fuss and without help. Maeva, who had spent 3 decades doing the same, should have recognized that. But she was tired and frightened, and watching her son's future walk toward her in a mud-colored dress, and all she could think was, "We have made a terrible mistake." The woman reached the gate. She did not open it. She set down her bag, straightened her back, and looked at the ranch carefully, reading it the way someone reads a letter they have waited a long time to receive. And Maeva, who had expected hesitation or nervousness, or the brittle brightness of someone trying too hard to please, saw neither. She saw patience, and that unsettled her more than anything else could have. Behind her, the ranch house held the silence that collects in places with too many empty rooms. The desk in the front parlor carried an open ledger, filled with her son's careful handwriting, and the numbers told the same story they had been telling for 2 years running. Garnet Creek was dying. Not the dramatic death of fire or flood, but the slow bleeding out that comes when a place needs 4 strong hands and has only 2. When the work outpaces the body, when each winter takes a little more than the following spring can give back. Maeva turned from the window. "Breck," she called toward the back of the house. No answer. She had not expected one. Her son would be in the barn, or the high pasture, or wherever a man of 29 goes, when something he agreed to, under duress, is about to arrive and become real. She called again. This time she heard the heavy scrape of a chair from the back room, the sound of boots finding the floor in the slow, reluctant way of a man who is not ready for what comes next. Breck Hollowell came into the kitchen and filled it. He had his father's height and his father's hands wide across the knuckle and scarred from wire and weather and the 1,000 small injuries that a working ranch deals out without apology. But the resemblance stopped at the eyes. Breck's eyes held not defeat. He was too stubborn for defeat, but the exhaustion of a man fighting a war on ground that keeps shifting under his feet. His eyes went past Maeva toward the window. "She's here?" he asked at the gate. He made no move toward the window. He stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set in the way Maeva knew meant he was holding back something he would regret saying. This had been Maeva's doing. She did not deny it, and she did not apologize for it. 6 months ago, sitting at this same table, with the same ledger, open between them, showing the same shrinking numbers, she had looked at her son and said what they had both known for a year, but neither had spoken. "You cannot do this alone. Breck, you need help. You need a wife." He had looked at her as though she had suggested he set fire to the barn. But she had pressed because Maeva Hollowell had not survived 31 years in Montana Territory, had not buried a husband and a daughter, had not held this ranch together through killing winters and summer drought, by being a woman who backed away from difficult conversations. She had written to the broker, she had described the ranch, the situation, the need. She had received a letter in return describing one Sineva Pell of Kettle Falls, Minnesota, 24 years of age, raised on a farm, no family remaining, willing to travel, willing to travel. Maeva had read those 3 words and understood something in them she could not have explained, something about a woman with no family remaining who would cross half a continent to marry a stranger. That was either courage or desperation, and Maeva knew from long experience that the two were sometimes the same thing. She had sent the fare. She had told Breck, who had said nothing for 2 full days and then said, "Fine," which in the language of her son meant something between surrender and the faintest margin of hope. And now, the woman was at the gate, and Breck was standing in the kitchen not looking at her, and Maeva could feel the weight of what came next, sitting between them like a third person in the room. "She's been standing there," Maeva said. "She didn't open the gate." Breck finally looked at her. His jaw worked once. "Is she what we need?" he asked. And Maeva, who had looked out the window and seen a small, plain woman with one bag to her name, who had thought the words terrible mistake as clearly and instinctively as breathing, who had felt disappointment land in her chest like a fist, said the only honest thing she could. "I don't know, but she's here and she came a long way, so you will go out there and you will be decent." Something shifted behind Breck's eyes. Not anger exactly. Something closer to grief, the grief of a man who had allowed himself the smallest sliver of hope that this one thing might be easy, and who was already watching that hope thin and fail. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. He put it on. He went out, and Maeva stayed at the window, because whatever happened next between her son and this woman from Minnesota, she intended to see it. Because the last time she had failed to watch something carefully at this ranch, it had cost her more than she could bear to remember. Breck Hollowell walked to the gate with the stride of a man approaching something he would rather walk away from. His shoulders sat high and his hands hung heavy, his whole body carrying the rigid courtesy of a person doing what he was raised to do rather than what he wanted to do. The woman watched him come. She never smiled, or adjusted her bonnet, or performed any of the small, anxious gestures of a woman trying to make a first impression. She simply stood there, with her hands folded over her bag, and waited for him to reach her, not with fear, not with eagerness, just with the understanding that it was coming, and there was nothing to be done but meet it. Breck stopped on the other side of the gate. He was a head and a half taller than her. His shadow fell across her face, and she looked up into it without squinting, without stepping back. "Miss Pell," he said. "It was not a greeting so much as a confirmation, Mr. Hollowell," she said. Her voice was lower than Maeva had expected, steady, with the faint trace of Scandinavian vowels that came from being raised among immigrants in the Northern Territories. "I'm sorry for arriving on foot. The stage left me in Alkali, and I was told the ranch was 3 miles east, but I believe it may be closer to 5. There was no complaint in it, no accusation. Just a statement of fact delivered with calm precision." Breck opened the gate. He made no offer to carry her bag. Maeva saw this from the window, and made a note of it in the ledger she kept inside her head, the one that tracked her son's behavior with the same careful attention he gave his cattle counts. The woman stepped through. Her eyes went past the house entirely. Her eyes moved to the south pasture where the cattle grazed, then to the irrigation channel along the east side, then to the barn with its patched roof, and the corral where 3 horses stood with their heads low. Maeva watched the woman's eyes and felt something shift. Not hope, not yet a question, because this woman was not looking at the ranch the way a bride looks at her new home. She was looking at it the way Oswin used to look at a new piece of equipment, taking it apart in her mind to see where the weaknesses lived. "You're running about 30 head," Sunniva said. Breck blinked. 34. She nodded, still looking at the pasture. "Your water channel has silted up past the second bend. I could see it from the road, from how the grass thins where the flow isn't reaching. You're losing ground on the south side because of it. Probably been losing it for a full season, maybe two." Breck said nothing, his face had gone very still. "And your hay barn," she said, turning slightly to look at the structure behind the main barn. "If that's where you're storing winter feed, you've got a ventilation problem. I can smell mold from here. Not much, but it's there. Another month and you'll lose a quarter of your stores before December." She looked back at Breck. She did not say these things with pride or challenge. She said them the way a doctor states symptoms. Without judgment, without pleasure. Just the plain reading of what was in front of her. "I grew up on a grain and cattle operation in Kettle Falls," she said. 42 acres. My father ran it and I kept the books and managed the stock rotation from the time I was 14. She paused. "After he passed, I ran it alone for 3 years." She let that settle. "I know what a ranch looks like when it's working. And I know what it looks like when it's not. I don't say that to be unkind, Mr. Hollowell. I say it because you wrote for someone useful, and I would like you to know that I am behind her." From somewhere near the barn, a sound rose into the afternoon stillness. A low guttural rumble that was not quite a growl and not quite a warning but lived in the territory between the two. Breck's eyes moved past Sunniva and Maeva saw him tense. A dog had appeared at the corner of the barn. This was Ketil, a vast, heavy-boned creature of uncertain breed and certain hostility who had belonged to Oswin Hollowell and had not, in the 4 years since Oswin's death, allowed a single stranger to cross the yard without making his position violently clear. Kettle was advancing toward Sunniva with the stiff-legged deliberation of an animal deciding whether this new presence constituted a threat or merely an inconvenience requiring correction. Breck started to move. "Miss Pell, you need to step behind me right now." Sunniva held her ground. She turned and looked at the dog. Kettle stopped, not because she had spoken or moved or made any gesture that Maeva could identify from the window. She had simply looked at him. And Ketil, who had not deferred to anything smaller than a bull elk in 4 years, stopped and stood still and looked back at her with an expression that Maeva had never seen on that animal's scarred and unforgiving face. It was confusion, pure, undiluted confusion, the look of a creature encountering something outside every category it had built for the world. Sunniva set down her bag. She lowered herself slowly, not crouching, not reaching out, just bringing herself closer to the dog's level with the unhurried patience of someone who understands that the first thing you offer a frightened animal is the choice not to be afraid. She waited. Kettle waited. The whole ranch seemed to hold its breath. Then the dog sat down. He simply sat, right there in the dirt, 5 feet from this stranger, and did not growl, and did not move, and did not look away. Breck Hollowell stared at his father's dog. His gaze moved to Sunniva Pell, crouched in the dust in her mud-colored dress, with her broken bag beside her, then back to Kettle, who had not voluntarily sat in the presence of a stranger since the day Oswin Hollowell was put in the ground. And something crossed Breck's face that Maeva, watching from the window with both hands pressed flat against the counter, could not quite read. It was not warmth. It was not welcome. It was the look of a man who has braced himself for disappointment so thoroughly that the absence of it feels like vertigo. He did not know what to do with this woman. And Maeva, who had spent 29 years reading her son's face, could see that this unsettled him far more than if she had been exactly the disaster he had prepared himself for. Supper that first evening was an exercise in careful silence. Maeva served elk stew and cornbread, and the 3 of them sat together while the October light failed outside the windows and the sound of Ketil pacing the porch boards came and went, like a slow and troubled clock. Suniva ate steadily, practically, without the self-conscious delicacy of a woman trying to impress. She complimented the stew once and did not repeat herself. Breck ate with his eyes on his plate. He did not address Suniva directly, and Maeva felt the slow, familiar weight of her son's stubbornness settling over the table. After supper, Suniva asked where she might wash up. Maeva showed her to the back room, the one that had been Oswin's study, and was now a small, spare bedroom with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the east pasture. It was not a wife's room, it was a guest's room, and everyone understood what that meant without it being said. "Thank you," Suniva said, and closed the door quietly behind her. Maeva went back to the kitchen. Breck was standing at the window with his back to her, looking at nothing. She knew things, Maeva said carefully, about the water channel, about the hay. Breck offered no reply. She was right about the hay, Maeva pressed. You know she was right, you've been worried about it yourself since September. Breck turned. His face was closed in the way it got when he had already made a decision, and was only waiting for the right moment to say it. "I'll pay her return fare," he said. "She can take the Thursday stage back to Billings, and connect to the Northern Pacific from there." Maeva studied him. "Breck, this isn't going to work, Ma." He said it flat, without cruelty, but with the heavy finality of a man who has measured something against what he needed and found it short. "You've known her for 4 hours. I've known enough." His jaw tightened. "She's not what we need. She's 110 pounds, and she's got one bag and she walked 5 miles in shoes that are coming apart at the sole. She looked at the ranch like she was appraising livestock. She looked at it like she understood it," Maeva said. Breck shook his head. He pulled his coat from the hook by the door. "The circuit preacher comes through Alkali on the 20th, he said. "That's 12 days. I'm not standing in front of Reverend Alt and making a promise I already know I can't keep." He went out. The door closed behind him. Maeva stood in the kitchen alone and listened to his boots cross the porch and descend the steps and move toward the barn, each footfall carrying the heaviness of a man walking away from something he does not want to face. Maeva sat down at the table. She picked up the ledger and studied the numbers she already knew. 34 head of cattle, down from 52, the year Oswin died. A hay supply that might last until February if the winter was mild, which in Montana Territory it never was. A water system silting up faster than one man could clear it, and a son who was 29 years old and aging like a man of 50, who had not smiled since the funeral, who was so accustomed to doing everything alone that the very idea of help felt like an accusation. "Thursday," Maeva said to the empty kitchen, the Thursday stage. She closed the ledger in the back room. Suniva Pell unpacked her bag in silence. One change of clothes, a pair of work boots with new soles she had stitched herself, a comb, a Bible, and a small leather journal with a pencil tied to its spine. And at the bottom, wrapped in flour sacking, a hinged wooden frame containing 2 tintype photographs. One of a man and a woman standing in front of a farmhouse, both of them looking at the camera with the solemn expression of people who have built something and know what it cost. The other was of the same farmhouse, but empty. No figures. Just the house and the land and the sky, and in the lower corner, barely visible, a bank notice nailed to the door. She set the photographs on the washstand where she could see them from the bed. She had no tears left. She had finished with that somewhere between St. Paul and Miles City, roughly 900 miles ago, and she did not intend to take it up again. She sat on the bed and opened her journal, and by the light of the single candle she wrote 3 lines. "Water channel requires clearing South Bend to East Gate. Hay stores compromised. Possible aspergillus inspect in morning. He is going to send me back." She underlined the last line once. Then she closed the journal, blew out the candle, and lay in the dark listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a ranch that did not yet know what to make of her. And she thought about the gate. How she had stood there and not opened it. How she had waited. She always waited. It was the thing people mistook for weakness, the stillness, the patience, the willingness to stand on the outside of a closed gate without reaching for the latch. But it was not weakness. It was the lesson her father had taught her the year before he died, standing at the fence of their own farm in Minnesota, watching a skittish mare decide whether to approach. "You cannot make a frightened thing trust you," he had said. "You can only stand still long enough for it to decide you are safe." She closed her eyes. 12 days until the circuit preacher came, 12 days before the man in the next room either married her or put her on a stage back to nowhere. She had worked with worse odds, she had survived with less. It came on the fourth morning. Seneva had spent the first 3 days doing exactly what no one had asked her to do, and nothing anyone could object to. She swept the kitchen before Maeva rose. She mended the chicken coop wire that had been letting a fox take a hen every third night. She scrubbed the root cellar and reorganized the preserves by date, so efficiently that Maeva felt both grateful and faintly embarrassed. Breck watched this from a distance, cataloging evidence for a verdict he had already reached. She was useful, he could see that, but he had not spoken to her about the Thursday stage. The arrangement sat between them like a held breath. On the fourth morning, Maeva woke to the sound that no rancher wants to hear before dawn. Cattle bawling. Not the ordinary complaint of hungry animals waiting for feed, but the high, sharp, distressed sound of an animal in real trouble. She pulled on her coat and went to the porch. Breck was already in the barn. She could see the lantern moving through the gaps in the boards, and then she heard his voice, tight and controlled. "Ma, get in here." Maeva crossed the yard in the dark. She bound Breck in the last stall on the east side, kneeling beside the best cow on the ranch, a 4-year-old crossbred called Nella, who had produced 2 strong calves in 2 seasons and was carrying a third. Nella was down on her side, her breathing fast and shallow, her legs moving in the restless, searching way of an animal trying to find a position that will make the pain stop. "She's been at it for hours," Breck said. His sleeves were rolled past his elbows, and his hands were slick, and his face held the tight expression of a man losing an argument with something he cannot control. "Calf's turned wrong. I can feel a leg, but I can't get purchase. Every time I try to reposition, she fights me." Maeva knelt beside him. She had helped with difficult calvings before, she and Oswin together, more times than she could count. But she had not done it in 4 years, and her hands were not what they had been, and she could see from the blood on the straw that this had already gone past the point where experience alone would be enough. "Can you reach it?" she asked. "I can reach it. I can't turn it." Breck's voice was strained. "If I push harder, I'll tear something and we'll lose them both." A silence fell between them, the silence that fills the space where a solution should be. And then from the barn door a voice. Quiet, level, entirely without panic. "How long has she been down?" They both turned. Seneva was standing in the doorway, in her work boots and a coat pulled on over her nightdress. Her hair was loose, and her face was pale in the lantern light, and she was looking at the cow with the same steady, assessing gaze she had turned on the ranch the day she arrived. Breck stared at her. "This isn't your concern, Miss Pell. How long?" she said again, not as a question this time. "Since before I found her, maybe 3 hours, maybe more." Seneva moved into the stall. She knelt on the other side of Nella and placed her hands on the cow's flank, not reaching inside, not interfering, and just feeling. Her fingers moved along the animal's side with the light, precise touch of someone reading a page in a language she knew well. "The calf is posterior," she said, "hind legs presenting instead of front, and it's large." She looked at Breck across the animal's heaving body. "You can't turn it from this angle. You need to reposition the cow first." "I can't reposition a 900-pound cow by myself. You don't need to do it by yourself," Seneva said. She looked at him. And for the first time since she had arrived at this ranch, Maeba saw something in this woman's eyes that was not patience and was not deference, and was not the careful, measuring calm she had worn like armor for 4 days. It was authority. The quiet, unshakable authority of someone who has done this exact thing before and has no intention of standing by while it goes wrong again. "Tell me what to do, or let me do it," she said to Breck. "But decide now, because in 20 minutes it won't matter either way." Breck looked at this woman kneeling across from him in the straw, with blood on the hem of her nightdress and lantern light on her face, and something behind her eyes that he had not seen in any of the 4 days she had been on his ranch. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time but was probably 3 seconds. Then he moved aside. Siniva did not hesitate. She rolled her sleeves past her elbows and spoke to Maiva without looking up. "I need rope," she said. "Two lengths, each about 4 feet, and something smooth and flat. A shingle or a board end. Nothing sharp, and warm water as much as you can carry." Maiva went. She did not question. She did not pause. She went with the relief of a person who has been waiting for someone to take charge. Suniva leaned close to Nella and placed one hand flat on the cow's neck. She spoke to the animal in a low, steady murmur that was not quite language and not quite song. To sound, continuous and warm, the frequency of calm when calm is the only medicine available. Nella's breathing slowed. Not much, but enough. The cow's wild eye tracked to Suniva and stayed there. "Here's what we're going to do," Suniva said to Breck, still speaking in that low, even tone. "I'm going to reposition the calf. I need you at her head. Keep her from rolling. When I say push, you press down on her shoulder. When I say hold, you don't move. Can you do that?" Breck moved to Nella's head. He put his hands on the cow's neck, and Suniva nodded once, and then she went to work. Maiva returned with the rope in water, and stood at the stall door and watched what happened next, because she understood somehow that this was a thing she would need to remember clearly. Suniva worked with her hands, and with the ropes, and with a patience that was not slowness but precision, the absolute refusal to rush a single movement when every movement mattered. She found the calf's hind legs and looped the rope around them gently. She used the flat board to ease the calf's hips past the point where they had locked. She spoke the whole time. Push hold," and Breck did what she said without question, which was a thing Maiva had not seen her son do for anyone since his father died. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of lantern light and low voices, and the ancient, desperate work of bringing something alive into the world when the world seems to be arguing against it, and then the calf came. Hind legs first, wet and trembling, then the body, then the head, and it landed in the straw with the graceless, miraculous weight of new life, while Nella raised her head and made a sound that was not distress, but recognition. Siniva cleared the calf's nose and mouth. She rubbed its sides with clean straw until it shuddered and kicked, and began trying to stand on legs it had never used before. She guided it toward Nella's head, and the cow began to lick her calf with focused, relentless attention. Siniva sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. Through the entire procedure, through every precise movement, her hands had been rock solid, and now that it was over, now that the calf was breathing and the crisis had passed, her hands shook. She closed them into fists, opened them, and closed them again. Then she wiped them on her nightdress, which was past saving anyway, and stood up. "She's going to need watching for the next 12 hours, Siniva said. "The delivery was hard. There could be tearing I couldn't feel. If she stops eating or her temperature rises, we'll need to act quickly." She turned to Breck. "Do you have iodine?" Breck was still kneeling at Nella's head. He was looking at the calf. A heifer, strong despite the rough entry, already trying to nurse. Then he turned to Suniva. He studied her as though she were a sentence he had read 3 times and still could not parse, as though the words were familiar but the meaning they were producing was not one he had prepared for. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. Her eyes went to the calf, and something private and quiet moved across her face. A memory that had nothing to do with this barn or this ranch, or this man she had been sent to marry. My father had a cow, she said finally. Same situation, posterior calf too large, middle of January. I was 16. He talked me through it. She paused. He made me do it because he said hands like mine were built for the work. Small enough to reach where his couldn't. Steady enough to do what needed doing. She did not add what Maeva could read in the geography of her face, that the memory of her father was both the source of her competence and the location of a wound she had not finished carrying from the barn door. A sound. Ketil padded into the stall and walked past Breck without acknowledgement. Walked past Maeva without a glance, and sat down next to Suniva, with the heavy, deliberate weight of a dog making a formal announcement. He leaned against her leg. He did not look at anyone else. Breck stared at the dog. Maeva stared at the dog. Kettle yawned, which, in the language of Kettle, meant the matter was settled and further discussion was unnecessary. Suniva rested one hand on his broad, scarred head. No smile crossed her face, but something in it eased tension, releasing that she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. The lantern light moved in the barn. The calf nursed. The cow rested. And outside, the first gray light of a Montana dawn pushed up over the eastern ridge and caught the frost on the fence posts and made them shine like a line of small cold stars, marking the boundary of a place that did not yet know it was about to change. The 20th of October came and went. The circuit preacher rode through Alkali on schedule, held a service in a back room of the general store, married the Lindquist boy to the Haverman girl, baptized a baby whose name Maeva later forgot, and rode on toward Fort Benton without stopping at Garnet Creek. Breck never went to town that day. He never mentioned the preacher. He never mentioned the Thursday stage, which had also come and gone without Suniva Pell on it. He spent the day repairing the corral gate and said nothing about any of it, and Maeva watched him and understood that her son had made a decision he was not ready to speak aloud. He had decided to let her stay. He had not decided what that meant, and so the arrangement continued to exist in the unnamed space between rejection and acceptance, between guest room and wife's room, between Miss Pell and whatever might come after. Suniva, for her part, never asked. She rose before dawn. She worked until supper, and she continued the quiet, methodical process of making herself indispensable to a ranch that did not yet know it needed her. The water channel was first. She started on it the morning after the calving, walking the full length of the irrigation ditch from the creek diversion to the east gate, with a spade over her shoulder and Ketel padding behind her like a large and battle-scarred escort. Breck saw her from the high pasture and rode down. "What are you doing?" he asked from the saddle, clearing the silt. She didn't look up. She was already waist-deep in the channel, shoveling with a rhythm that suggested long practice. "It's backed up past the second bend, like I said. But the silt is only part of it. Whoever built this channel ran it straight through a clay deposit about 40 yards back. Every spring the snowmelt carries more clay down and packs it tighter. You've been losing flow for years, not just this season." Breck was quiet. His father had built that channel. "I can rewrote the last section," she said, reading his silence with a precision that matched everything else about her around the clay. "Not through it. It'll take 3 days and about 20 yards of new digging. But once it's done, the silting stops." She raised her eyes to him. "If that's all right," it was such a small thing, those last 3 words. If that's all right, she could have simply done it. She was already doing it. But she asked. And in the asking she gave him back something he had not realized he was losing, the sense that this was still his place, his decision, his land, even as she quietly set about saving it. "Do it," Breck said. He rode back up the hill. He was not ready for what "thank you" would mean between them. But he glanced back once from the ridge, and Maeva, who happened to be watching from the kitchen window, because she always happened to be watching from the kitchen window, saw him look. 3 days later, the channel ran clear. Water reached the south pasture for the first time in 2 full seasons, and the grass responded within a week, coming back with the slow, eager gratitude of something that had been waiting for an invitation. The hay was next. Suniva pulled every bale from the feed barn, inspected each one by hand, and separated the clean from the compromised with unsentimental efficiency. She burned the moldy bales, a full quarter of the winter supply, which made Breck go pale when he saw the smoke. But she had already calculated the loss, and had a plan for it. A plan she presented to him that evening at supper in the plain organized language of someone who has been keeping books since she was tall enough to reach a desk. "We can supplement with browse and native hay from the river bottom," she said. "There's good timothy growing along the north bank that nobody's cutting. If we harvest it this week and stack it properly with ventilation channels between the rows, we'll make up most of what we lost, and next year we cure earlier and store in smaller bales with airflow. The mold won't come back," she said. Maeva noticed it. Breck noticed it. Neither of them corrected it. The days shortened. October thinned into November, and the first frost came, hard and white, turning the ranch into a landscape of silver mornings and long blue shadows. Suniva worked through the cold, without complaint and without performance, just the steady application of effort to problem until the problem was smaller. She rebuilt the chicken coop from salvaged lumber and increased the laying count by a third inside 2 weeks. She reorganized the tack room so that every piece of equipment had a place and could be found in the dark, which mattered when a horse threw a shoe at 4 in the morning. She found a leak in the main water trough that had been losing a gallon an hour into the ground, so small that Breck had never noticed, and so constant that over 2 years it had cost him more water than a dry August. She kept a ledger. This was the thing that changed Breck's silence into something else. She had started it in her journal, the same leather journal she had brought with her, but within 2 weeks she had filled it and asked Maeva if there was a spare book in the house she might use. Maeva gave her Oswin's old accounts ledger, the one with the green cloth cover that had sat in the desk drawer since his death, because neither Maeva nor Breck could bring themselves to write in a dead man's book. Suniva took it without ceremony. She opened it to the first blank page after Oswin's last entry, a cattle count from March of 1879, written in the careful, square handwriting of a man who believed that keeping track of things was a form of respect, and she began to write. She recorded everything: feed consumption, water usage, grazing rotation, calving dates, weight estimates, fence condition, and weather patterns. She built, in the pages of a dead man's book, a portrait of the ranch so detailed that Breck, who had been running Garnet Creek on instinct and exhaustion for 4 years, began to see his own land through different eyes. He started reading the ledger in the evenings. He never asked permission. He simply picked it up from the desk where she left it, and read it with the quiet attention of a man whose trust is forming faster than his pride will allow him to admit. One evening he asked her a question about the grazing rotation she had proposed, and they talked about it for 20 minutes, the longest continuous conversation they had shared since her arrival, and when it was over he nodded once and said, "That makes sense," which in the language of Breck Hollowell was an ovation. Supper changed. It was small at first, so small that only Maeva noticed. Breck began to speak at the table, not freely, but in short, deliberate sentences. Finding his way back to conversation like a person finding a path overgrown with disuse, he asked Suniva about the cattle. About the weather forecast, she had intuited from the birds along the creek, an old farmer's trick learned from her father about whether the south pasture fence would hold through a hard winter. He was asking her opinion. Maeva felt something shift in her chest, not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it, something with the same shape. One evening in the second week of November, Breck came in from the barn and found Suniva sitting at the desk with the green ledger and a candle. And he stopped in the doorway and said, "You should have a better light." The next day, he moved the oil lamp from his own bedroom to the desk, without comment. Suniva said, "Thank you." Breck made no answer. He went to the barn to check the stock, and Catil, who had taken to sleeping across the threshold of Siniva's door like a sentry, lifted his head and watched Breck go and then put his head back down with the satisfied heaviness of a dog who understands the direction of things, even when the people involved do not. The town found out, of course. Alkali was not the sort of place where a plain, quiet woman could arrive at a bachelor rancher's property and go unremarked. The word traveled, not maliciously, but inevitably, passed from the general store to the feed depot to the church steps. The Hollowell boy got his bride, they said. And then, plain as a fence post, poor thing. Maeva heard this once in town, and held her tongue. But she thought about it on the ride home, and she thought about the water channel running clear, and the south pasture greening, and the ledger filling up with Siniva's careful handwriting, and she wondered how people could look at a fence post and see only the post and never the field it holds together. And through all of this, through the work and the suppers and the slow accumulation of trust built in small gestures and careful silences, Suniva Pell did not speak about Minnesota. She answered questions about technique, about her father's methods, about how she had learned to read weather or handle a sick animal or balance a ledger. But the answers always stopped at a certain border, a line drawn between knowledge and history, between what she knew and how she had come to be a woman who knew these things and had nothing but a worn bag to show for it. She carried it like a stone in her pocket, always there, always felt, never shown. And Maeva, who carried her own stones and knew their weight, watched and waited and did not ask until she did. The question came on a night in late November when the first real storm had settled over the valley and the wind was doing something to the barn roof that sounded expensive. They were sitting after supper, the three of them, in the pattern that had become their evening ritual. Breck in the chair by the stove with a piece of harness he was mending, Maeva at the table with her knitting, Suniva at the desk with the green ledger and the oil lamp that had once been Breck's. Keto lay across the threshold of the front room with the absolute commitment of a dog who has claimed a position and intends to hold it through the winter and possibly into the following spring. Maeva set down her knitting. She studied Suniva for a long moment. Then she said, "What happened to your father's farm?" Suniva Breck's hands stopped on the harness. He did not look up, but his stillness was its own kind of attention. Suniva was quiet. She closed the ledger slowly and placed her pencil across its cover with the precise, deliberate care of a person putting something away before opening something else. "He died in the spring of 1880, she said. Pleurisy. He'd been sick through the winter, but he wouldn't stop working because the calving was coming and there was nobody else." She paused. "The fire moved in the stove. I ran it after he died. I was 21. I knew the land, and I knew the animals, and I knew the books. I thought that would be enough." She looked at her hands resting on the closed ledger. The same hands that had delivered a calf in this barn, cleared a water channel, and written numbers in a dead man's book, with the steady script of a woman who believes that precision is a form of love. "The first year was all right," she said, "hard, but all right. I sold enough cattle to cover the mortgage and put a little aside. The second year the wheat failed. Rust in the grain. I'd never seen it before, because my father had always rotated the fields in a way that prevented it, and I didn't understand until too late that I had planted the same field twice in succession." Her eyes stayed on her hands. "I borrowed against the land," she said. "I went to the bank in Kettle Falls, and I sat across the desk from a man who looked at me the way men look at a young woman, asking for money, as though the asking itself is a kind of confusion, and I signed a note I believed I could repay. The wind pressed at the windows, the storm was getting closer. I couldn't," she said. "The following spring was wet and cold, and the calves came late and weak, and I lost 4 of them in 2 weeks. The bank sent a man in August. He nailed a notice to my door and gave me 30 days. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was level and steady, but there was something beneath it now. A current, strong enough to pull you off your feet if you weren't careful. I sold what I could carry, and I paid the fare to St. Paul. I worked in a boarding house for a year, cooking, cleaning, mending, then a textile mill, then another boarding house. Then I saw the notice from the marriage broker, and I thought. She stopped. She looked at the fire behind the stove's iron door, and for a moment Maeva saw on this plain, steady woman's face the thing she had been carrying all this time. Not self-pity, not bitterness. The precise, unflinching knowledge of exactly where she had failed and exactly what it had cost her. I thought if I couldn't save my own land, she said, maybe I could save someone else's. The room was silent. The wind moved around the corners of the house. Cattell shifted at the threshold and sighed the deep, gusty sigh of a dog who feels things he cannot articulate. Breck spoke for the first time. He did not look up from the harness. What was the farm called? He asked. Sunniva looked at him. Eldstead, she said. It means fireplace in the old language. My grandparents named it when they came from Norway. Breck nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, still not looking up, still working the letter with his hands. My father built Garnet Creek from nothing, 40 acres the first year. He and my mother lived in a sod house for 2 winters before they could afford timber, he said. The land talked to him, said if you listened right it would tell you what it needed. He paused. I stopped listening after he died. I was too angry to listen. It was the most Breck Hollowell had said about his father in Sunniva's presence. It was the most he had said about his father in Maeva's presence since the funeral. Maeva picked up her knitting. She worked 3 stitches before she spoke, because some things need a breath before them. Like a rest in music that is not silence, but part of the song. You didn't stop listening, she said to her son. You just forgot that the land wasn't the only thing worth hearing. She kept her eyes from Sunniva when she said this. She had no need to. The sentence went where it was meant to go, and the 3 of them sat in the quiet after it, listening to the storm build outside and the firework inside, and something that had been rigid between them for 7 weeks, bent without breaking. Aldous Cray came to Garnet Creek on a Tuesday in December, riding a black gelding that was worth more than most of the homesteads in the valley combined. He brought with him a man in a town coat carrying a leather case, and a second man on a sorrel mare, who wore no expression and carried a rifle across his saddle with the easy negligence of someone who considers it part of his clothing. Maeva saw them from the window. She had seen Cray before, everyone in the Alkali Valley had. He was a consolidator, a man who had spent 3 years buying up struggling ranches between Helena and the Yellowstone, assembling them into a vast operation the territorial papers called the Cray Holdings. He bought cheap. He bought from the desperate, the widowed, and the tired. He had a lawyer and a banker, and the patient manner of a man who understood that in Montana Territory, winter did most of his negotiating for him. He had approached Breck twice the previous year. Breck had said no, twice, the first time, politely. The second time from the porch, with his father's rifle visible in the crook of his arm, which was not a threat so much as a vocabulary choice, the word no expressed in a dialect Cray would understand. But that had been a year ago, and a year of declining cattle counts and silting water channels and a barn roof held together by stubbornness had changed the arithmetic. Breck was in the far pasture. Maeva watched the 3 riders at the gate and felt the old fears settle in her stomach. She turned to go to the barn. Sunniva was already on the porch. She had come out through the kitchen door without sound, standing at the railing in her work coat, with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes on the 3 men at the gate. Kettle was pressed against her leg, rigid, every hair on his body oriented toward the riders with focused hostility. Do you know who that is? Sunniva asked. Maeva stood beside her. His name is Aldous Cray. He wants this ranch. He's wanted it for a year. Sunniva looked at the man on the black gelding, the lawyer with the leather case, the rifleman on the sorrel. She studied them with the same careful, unhurried assessment she gave everything, taking the situation apart number by number until she understood where the balance sat. "Where is Breck?" she asked. "North pasture. It'll take him 20 minutes to get back if he sees them. Longer if he doesn't." Suniva nodded. She turned to Maeva. "Has Breck ever?" asked Cray. "Why he wants this ranch specifically?" Maeva frowned. "It's good land. 400 acres of grass and water. It's adequate land," Suniva said. And the correction was so gentle and so precise that Maeva almost missed its significance. 400 acres with a silted water channel and a compromised hay supply, and a herd that's been declining for 4 years. Cray owns 11,000 acres of better grass between here and the Mussel Shell. He doesn't need this ranch for the cattle. Her eyes held Maeva's. He needs it for the water. Maeva stared at her. Garnet Creek is a perennial waterway, Suniva said. It runs year-round, even in drought summers. And your water rights date back to your husband's original claim in 1852. Prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. Every ranch downstream of this creek, including 3 that Cray already owns, depends on the water that flows through your property." She paused. "If he owns Garnet Creek, he controls the water supply for half the valley. That's not a cattle operation, that's a monopoly." The gate opened. Cray was coming up the road. The lawyer and the rifleman flanked him. Suniva stepped off the porch. Maeva reached for her arm. "Suniva." Suniva looked back at her. The face was calm. The eyes were steady. But behind the steadiness was something Maeva had seen only once before, in the barn, kneeling over a cow in distress. That quiet, unmistakable authority of a woman who knows exactly what is happening and has no intention of standing aside while it happens wrong. "Go find Breck," Suniva said, "but don't rush. I don't want Mr. Cray to think we're frightened." She walked to the gate. Catil walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside, matching her pace with the disciplined precision of an animal who has chosen his commanding officer and intends to maintain formation. Suniva stopped at the fence. She folded her hands in front of her. She waited. Cray looked down at her from the saddle. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a silver beard trimmed close, and the well-fed competence of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any conversation. His eyes moved over Suniva quickly, dismissively. "I'm here to see Hollowell," he said. "Mr. Hollowell is occupied," Suniva said. "I manage the books and operations for Garnet Creek. You can speak with me." Cray's expression did not change, but something recalibrated behind it, the faint adjustment of a man encountering an obstacle where he expected empty air. "And you are Suniva Pell?" She did not add any title or explanation. She let the name stand alone, because a name that needs qualification is a name that is already apologizing for itself. "Miss Pell," Cray said, and the word "miss" carried a weight he did not bother to disguise. "I have a standing offer for this property, a fair one. I've brought my attorney to formalize the terms." He glanced at the lawyer, who opened the leather case and produced a document with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who has produced this document many times before. Suniva ignored the document. She kept her eyes on Cray. "Cray," she said, "your offer is for the land, the structures, the stock, and the water rights associated with the original Hollowell claim of 1852. Is that correct?" A beat. The lawyer glanced at Cray. Cray's eyes narrowed slightly, the first indication that this conversation was not following the course he had mapped for it. "That's correct," he said. Suniva nodded. "Then your offer, whatever the number, is inadequate, because you valued the property as a cattle operation, which at current production would support an offer of perhaps $1,200. But the water rights alone, given that Garnet Creek supplies the primary irrigation for the Vetch Creek, Harlow and South Fork parcels, all of which I believe you acquired in the past 2 years, are worth considerably more than that." Silence. The wind moved through the valley. The lawyer closed the leather case slowly. I've reviewed the territorial water statutes, Suniva continued. Prior appropriation in Montana Territory is absolute. Your downstream operations depend entirely on the flow from this creek, and this ranch holds the senior rights. If we were to exercise those rights fully, the downstream impact on your properties would be significant. She paused. I expect you already know this. It's why you've been patient. Cray looked at her. The dismissal was gone from his face. In its place was something harder, the flat attentiveness of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him has a different composition than he assumed. The rifleman shifted on the sorrel. Catil growled low and sustained. Garnet Creek is not for sale, Suniva said. Not the land, not the stock, and not the water. If you'd like to discuss a water-sharing agreement at fair market rates, you can write to me and I will review the terms. Otherwise, I don't believe we have further business. Cray's gaze moved to the house behind her, then to the pastur's green on the south side where they had been brown 2 months ago, the water channel running clean and full. He looked back at Suniva Pell, 5 feet and 2 inches tall in a work coat, standing at a fence in the December cold with a scarred dog at her side, and the unperformable calm of a woman who has lost everything once and has decided that she will not watch it happen again. This isn't finished, he said. It is today, Suniva said. Good afternoon, Mr. Cray. Cray turned his horse. The lawyer followed. The rifleman looked at Suniva for a moment longer than the others, and something crossed his face that might have been respect. And then he turned the sorrel, and the three of them rode back down the road toward Alkali. Suniva stood at the gate until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then she turned around. Breck Hollowell was standing at the corner of the barn. He had come back from the north pasture by the back trail, riding hard because he had seen strangers at his gate. He had his father's rifle in one hand and the reins in the other, and he was looking at Suniva with an expression that Maiva, standing on the porch, had not seen on her son's face since he was a boy, and his father had shown him something that changed how he understood the world. Wonder. Simple, unguarded wonder that evening. Breck Hollowell did something he had not done since the night his father died. He went to the back of the pantry and brought out the bottle of plum brandy that Oswin had put up in the autumn of 1878 from the tree behind the house. There were 3 bottles originally. 2 had been opened for family milestones. The third had never been opened because Oswin had said he was saving it for something that warranted it, and then he had died before the warranting came. He set down 2 glasses. Then he paused and got a third. Maeva watched this from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. Because some gestures are so full that words around them would only get in the way. Suniva came in from the evening feeding. She saw the bottle, the glasses, and the look on Breck's face. She sat down at the table without asking what the occasion was, because Suniva Pell had an instinct for moments that needed to be entered quietly. Breck poured 3 glasses of dark amber brandy that caught the lamplight like something molten. He pushed one to Suniva, one to his mother. He picked up the third but did not drink. I need to say some things, he said. He looked at the glass in his hands. He was not a man who said things easily. Every word had to travel a long distance from wherever it started inside him to reach his mouth, and the journey showed on his face. When my mother wrote to the broker, he said, I didn't want it. Any of it I thought it was. He stopped, started again. I thought needing help meant I'd failed. I thought if I couldn't hold this ranch by myself, I didn't deserve to hold it at all. He turned the glass. I was wrong about that. The fire moved in the stove. Kettle, who had followed Suniva inside and was lying under the table with his head on her boot, shifted and settled when you came up that road, Breck said. And he looked at her now, looked at her with the full, unguarded attention of a man who has decided to stop protecting himself from what he sees. I looked at you, and I thought you were not what I needed. I looked at you, and I saw someone who couldn't help me. He stopped. The next words were hard. Mayaba could see them being hard, could see her son pulling them up from somewhere deep, like a fence post from frozen ground. I was wrong about that too, he said. Suniba held her glass, but did not drink. She was watching him with the patient, steady attention. She gave everything, but something behind it was different now. Something was open that had been closed, like a window letting the air in, even when the air is cold. Breck set his glass down. I talked to my mother's lawyer in Alkali, he said. Last week I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure yet. But I asked him about partnership law in the territory, about how a ranch can be held by more than one name. The room was very quiet. I want to put you on the deed, he said. Not as a wife, not as a favor, as an owner. 30% of Garnet Creek, filed with the county, legal and permanent, because you see this land the way my father saw it, and you know things about it that I don't, and because what you did today saved this ranch, in a way I could not have saved it, and I need to stop pretending that needing you is something to be ashamed of. Suniva was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered, the wind moved outside the windows. When she spoke, her voice was steady but not untouched, the voice of a woman holding something carefully because she understands how easily held things can break. I lost my father's land, she said. I lost it because I was proud and I was young and I thought knowing how to work was the same as knowing how to save. And I have carried that with me every day since, the weight of a place that trusted me and that I let go. She looked at her hands on the table, the same hands that had cleared the channel and delivered the calf, and turned the pages of a dead man's ledger with tender attention. I came here to be useful, she said. I came here because I thought if I couldn't save my own place, maybe I could earn the right to help save someone else's. I did not come here expecting. She paused. The words she did not say filled the room anyway, the way unspoken things do when the silence around them is honest enough to hold their shape. Her eyes found Breck. I'll earn it, she said. Breck looked back at her. You already have. That's why I'm asking. A brightness came into Suniva's eyes that had nothing to do with the lamplight and everything to do with the devastating relief of a person who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has just been told she can set it down. Maeva picked up her glass. She had been sitting at this table for 31 years, through births and deaths, and blizzards and droughts. She had watched her husband build this ranch and watched her son nearly lose it, and watched this quiet, extraordinary woman walk up a road with one bag and save it. She raised her glass to Garnet Creek, she said. Breck raised his. To Garnet Creek. Suniva raised hers. To the land, she said, and to the people stubborn enough to stay on it. They drank. Oswin's plum brandy tasted like autumn and patience and something Maeva could only describe as time given back. Breck's gaze rested on Suniba across the table, the woman he had wanted to send home on a Thursday stage 8 weeks ago. The woman nobody in Alkali believed in, the woman his dog had chosen before he had the sense to. He did not say what he was thinking. He was not ready for all of it yet. But the part of it that he was ready for, the part that was about the land and the ledger and the water rights, and the future of a ranch that had remembered how to breathe, that part he had said, and that was enough for tonight, under the table. Kettle sighed the long, contented sigh of a dog who has been right about something for 2 months, and is pleased to see the humans finally catching up. Cray came back in January. He came with a different lawyer, a thicker document, and a tone of patient finality. He found Suniva at the gate, Breck at the barn door. Kettle at the fence line, radiating disapproval with every scarred and bristling inch of his considerable frame. The document was an offer, dressed as a warning. It cited declining property values, the cost of winter operations, and the inevitability of debt. Suniva listened to the lawyer read it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she spoke. Garnet Creek is now a registered partnership under territorial law. She said M.S. Hollowell, Mr. Hollowell, and myself. Any offer must be reviewed by all 3 partners and our attorney in Alkali, whose name I will provide. Additionally, I have filed a formal assessment of our senior water rights with the Territorial Surveyor's Office. That assessment is now part of the public record." She paused. She let the pause do its work. "Any future attempt to pressure this ranch into a sale will be interpreted in the context of that record," she said. "And I expect the territorial courts would find it very interesting that a man who controls 11,000 downstream acres has been making repeated unsolicited offers on the one property that controls his water supply." Cray looked at Breck. Breck looked back at him with his father's rifle in the crook of his arm and the expression of a man who has stopped being tired and started being certain. Cray left. He did not come back. The winter that followed was the kind Montana uses to remind people what they have agreed to by living there. 6 weeks of cold that turned the water in the troughs to stone every night and made the mornings a battle between necessity and endurance. Snow came in January and did not leave until March, turning the world into a white, silent, relentless test of everything Suniva had built and everything Breck had learned to trust. They worked through it together. That was what Maeva noticed most. The word together, which had not applied to anything at Garnet Creek for 4 years. Breck and Suniva moved through the winter chores in a rhythm that had developed without discussion, each filling the gap the other had left. They did not lose a single animal. They did not run out of feed. The hay stores, properly ventilated, properly cured, held through February without a trace of mold. The water channel, rerouted around the clay, ran clear even under the ice. By the time March came and the first melt began and the south pasture showed the pale, tentative green of grass, remembering how to grow, something had settled at Garnet Creek that Maeva had not felt since before her husband died, not the absence of grief. She still climbed the hill some evenings and stood beside the 2 markers, Oswins and Fennas, and said things into the mountain air that belonged to them alone. That would always be there. Grief does not leave a house. It just learns slowly to make room for other things. But the other things were there now, and they filled the rooms that grief had emptied with sounds Maeva had forgotten she missed. 2 voices in the barn at dawn talking about fence line and calving schedules, and the price of feed in Alkali. The scratch of a pencil in a green ledger at the desk by the window. The heavy, satisfied thump of Catil dropping onto the porch boards after completing his morning patrol, which he conducted with the solemn diligence of a dog who considers property security a sacred calling. The sound of supper at 6, where the conversation now stretched past the meal and into the evening, ranging across the land and the seasons and the slow, careful accumulation of plans for a ranch that had stopped surviving and started becoming something more. The sound of a house that had found its footing again. On the first warm evening in April, Maeva found Breck and Suniva sitting on the top rail of the south pasture fence side by side, watching the cattle move through the new grass in the long golden light of a Montana spring. The south pasture, which had been brown and sparse a year ago, was green from the fence line to the creek, thick and even. The kind of grass that makes a cattleman's heart do something it will never admit to doing. Maeva climbed up beside them. She was 60 years old, and her joints informed her of this in unfriendly terms. But she managed. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that does not need filling because it is already full. "The circuit preacher is coming through next week," Maeva said. She said it plainly, without decoration, as a woman sets a plate on a table. Breck looked at Suniva. Suniva looked at Breck. And something passed between them that Maeva could see but did not need to translate, because some conversations do not require language, only the willingness to be understood. "I'd like that," Suniva said. Breck nodded. He did not say anything because he had already said the things that mattered, and the rest was just confirmation. But he reached across the space between them and took her hand. And this was so unprecedented a gesture from a man who had spent 29 years keeping the world at arm's length that Maeva had to look away for a moment and study the mountains with great interest until the feeling in her throat had passed. Below them, the cattle grazed in the late light. 38 head now. 4 more than the autumn count. The spring calves healthy and strong. The fences stood straight and solid, every post driven right. The water channel ran clear from the creek to the east gate, catching the sun in a line of silver that divided the green pasture like a sentence written in a language only the land could read. People in Alkali would talk about Garnet Creek in the years that followed. They would say the Hollowell Ranch had turned around, that it had become the steadiest operation in the valley, with water rights worth more than gold, and a herd that grew every season. Some of them would remember the plain woman who had walked up the road in a mud-colored dress with one bag, and they would shake their heads and say they never would have guessed, which was true, but was also the thing they had missed from the beginning. They were looking for salvation in the shape they expected, and it had come in the shape it chose. Suniva sat on the fence rail in the April light and looked at the ranch she had helped save. She thought about a farm in Kettle Falls with a bank notice on the door. She thought about a gate she had stood at without opening, waiting, as her father had taught her, for the frightened thing on the other side to decide she was safe. She thought about how you carry a loss inside you like a stone, and how one day, if you were stubborn enough and willing to walk 5 miles in shoes that are coming apart, you find a place where you can set the stone down, not forget it. Just set it beside you on a fence rail in the evening light and let it become part of the landscape rather than the whole of it. Maeva was right. What she had told Breck all those months ago, the land was not the only thing worth hearing. But it had taken a woman that nobody believed in, a woman plain as a fence post. God help them, to teach them both how to listen. The sun dropped toward the peaks. Kettle completed his final patrol and came to sit below the fence, pressing himself against the post nearest to Suniva, claiming his position with the absolute authority of a dog who has known the right answer all along. The three of them sat there and watched the light go gold and long across the pride of Montana, and nobody said anything because there was nothing left to say that the land was not already saying for them.